This conference will now be recorded.
I'm sorry?
Have you all gone through the syllabus?
Not really, but I'll go through after the meeting.
Okay. Okay, fine. Let's quickly go through the syllabus and then also talk about one of the important topics where we would understand the end-to-end testing and where the test automation stands, and then what kind of holistic picture with respect to with respect to the test automation and then its integration within the agile flow, right? So we would try to understand that today. Okay, so let's start with this. So are you people able to see my screen?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Able to see? Great. Okay, I would zoom it a bit for your convenience. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead. So what we would try to understand from this entire syllabus, right? So we would try to understand what automation is for and why and what kind of benefits we would have. Most probably, most of the people might understand this a bit, but we would deep dive into certain topics in and around this test automation, why it is required, and then we would also try to understand the holistic, history of the Selenium. So from where it came into, like the IDE, WebDriver, Grid. So there are lots of enhancements that happen within Selenium, right? So we would try to understand its evolution. So how Selenium evolved, and then it is very much important for us to understand the Selenium components as well, right? Whatever components that are part of the Selenium, so we should be understanding them as well, because those concepts are very much important for us to drive our test automation, right? And then we will also discuss about why it would be C sharp with Selenium, right? And
Mm.
what kind of applications, right, for which we usually go by C sharp with Selenium, correct? So we would try to understand that as well. That means we would also understand hand in hand, in parallel, that the approach that we need to take in order to select a tool and as well as the language, right? So we need to understand that as well. So we would see that perspective as well, and then we would quickly jump into the setting up the environment, right? So the environment, in the sense, the tools that we use or the IDE that we use, and then the Selenium WebDriver, right? So how to install it, how to install browsers, uh, mostly the browsers majorly we use like Chrome, Firefox, and then the Edge. And we would also see how to create a basic Selenium project, right? So these are something we would see in the module 2. And then what we go ahead is to quickly understand certain components within the N unit. Okay, what this N unit stands for, and how to write the test cases and how to execute the test cases. So we would also look into that concept. But and then in the module 3, this would be majorly concentrated on the or focused on the Selenium. Why? Because Selenium itself is a package, and that particular package has its own classes, its own methods inbuilt, which in turn we would use in order to automate our applications, right? Automate and test. So within that, we have various other concepts as well, some bits and pieces of concepts related to the framework as well, like page object model. So we would also see what this page object model is, right? How we implement the page object model along with Selenium C Sharp. So we would also deal with that. And then there would be some advanced concepts related to the Selenium and as well as the automation framework, like data driven testing with the Selenium. So how to deal with the test data maintenance. So test data can be maintained in a CSV, Excel, JSON file, or an XML file, or onto a databases, right? So we would deal with them, and we would see how to connect and read those data, right? And then what we do, we would see how we can implement the data driven testing using this NUnit. We have seen in the module 2, right? Basic introduction on the NUnit. So we would take it a bit higher, uh, with understanding the data driven techniques, right? And then we would also deal with handling the dynamic web elements. So this is very much important during your interviews as well. So most of the uh, questions in the interview, they come at this handling of the dynamic web elements. So what are these dynamic web elements and what are the basic web elements that we have, right? So why we are calling them as web elements? What is a web page? What is a browser? And how this page is being loaded into the browser? So what are the key components within it? So we would also see and look into it. Okay. And then we would also deal with cross-browser testing, right? So we have multiple browsers. Maybe there could be a requirement from one of the projects where you work, and the client might ask, like, I want my application to be executed on various browsers, right? We have multiple browsers. So now there should be some strategy for it, and then we should be handling it, right? So that's where we would talk about this introduction to the Selenium grid, and as well as the cross-browser testing, how we would set up that, and running the tests on Selenium grid. So we would talk about that as well. Okay. And then we would see how we can enhance our framework. I mean, first we have gone through the NUnit integration. So we have NUnit framework, and we try to understand the concepts of the NUnit framework, test data driven approach. And then what we do is we quickly jump into the BDD. BDD is behavior driven testing, right? So which we would uh, integrate with our Selenium test scripts. So we would see how this behavior driven development works, and then how to write the BDD test cases. So there are tools which we can use in order to generate the BDD or the Gherkin format, right? Basically, we would say Gherkin language. It's purely in English, but there would be certain keywords using which we create our test cases. So we would understand what are those keywords, what are the specific usage of each of these keywords, and then we would also try to implement this BDD using the spec flow. Okay, spec flow is again a installable package. So we would see what these are and how we integrate this with behavior driven testing framework, and how to proceed with our test execution using the BDD and spec flow along with Selenium C#, right? And then we also try to deal with the continuous integration. So continuous integration is the part which we would primarily focus or try to understand today on a high level during this introductory session. And we would see what kind of tools we have and the end-to-end flow, right? So we can understand that, and then look up to this syllabus and see if this particular section or the syllabus, right? The entire syllabus covers the various parts of our agile flow or not, right? Such that you would also get some confidence on the course that we have come up with as a package, right? So we talk about Jenkins. We talk about configuring the Selenium C# Selenium projects on Jenkins and how to integrate them, right, to our frameworks. So we would also implement the pipelines. We talk about this, what these pipelines are. So how we would create them, how we execute them, how we set up a parallel test execution, right? So why this parallel test execution is required, we will talk about those as well. And for every module, so you would have a live session, live demo from my side. I would showcase to you people on how we do this, how we set up this end to end, along with setting up this, I mean, or generating the code and other stuff. So you would definitely have the recordings and as well as the course content, right? So I would provide you with the material, course material. So for each of the module, by the time we start that module, I would be keep sharing the content as well. Okay, clear on this part? So now, yeah, about the Jenkins implementation, and then we would also talk about continuous testing with Azure DevOps. Now we would see soon why this Azure DevOps is included into our course, and why it is very much required here, right? And then we would also talk about the best practices and optimization. It is not just about learning automation with C Sharp and Selenium and then, you know, um, going back to home. So we would also learn about the best practices and the optimization techniques that usually we use in the day-to-day life when we come up with this test automation projects. So how we do this code maintenance, the test code maintenance, and how we can write a clean code, and how we can handle the test failures, debugging them, how to debug them. So we would talk on all of those lines, right? And then the strategies, the test automation strategies. So it is not just about the test automation with Selenium C Sharp. So it has this end-to-end course where you would learn various other test automation strategies as well. We would also talk about the performance optimization, where how you can achieve this reducing of the test execution time and optimizing the test suites with CI/CD integration, right? So we talk about them, and we would also deal with a real-time project. So we would take some of the case studies and then start working from the scratch, implementing the page object models, data driven techniques, and the VDD approaches. Whatever we have learned in the entire syllabus, we would try to implement that, right? So that's part of our syllabus. And then, yeah, so CI/CD. So we would also start reviewing any other, case studies, successful case studies of the test automation projects, right, from the real world. And then we would also have some preparation for any kind of interviews, right? So we would also provide the interview questions, the frequently asked questions. It's not just about Selenium and C Sharp, and it those interview questions also have um, the tips and tricks for cracking them, right? So you would get all of this. Clear on this part?
Sir, will you cover extent reporting, which is important?
Yeah, we cover the alert reporting and extend reports
Got it.
in
Thank you.
the framework integration, right?
Sounds
We
good. Thank you.
also talk about inbuilt Azure DevOps reports, right?
Okay.
Also integration of the test cases with the Azure DevOps. So we will take it in depth. It's not just about a high level discussion here. So we would take it in depth, and then that's where we have these test automation strategies, and then continuous testing and feedback loops, how we get them right. It's based upon the reporting. So now the reporting can be using extent reports, alert reports, or it can be the integrated reporting mechanism that we have in Azure DevOps itself. So we have to understand what kind of features that Azure DevOps brings in, right? So in the similar way, we also have to understand what kind of features and advantages that we get when we integrate with alert reporting, and what kind of advantages and what kind of challenges probably we face if we are trying to integrate it with extent reports. We need to try to understand them, right? Unless we understand them, both the pros and cons, so we may not able to decide on which reporting mechanism we want to use, right, or utilize in our projects. So it's all about analysis, and then the approach, strategy, implementation, and then the end-to-end CI/CD, right? And along with that, we also would deal with this interview preparations as well. Okay. Any questions till now? So this is the entire end-to-end course that I have come up with. Clear on this part?
Sir, I have one doubt.
Yeah.
So the framework, what you're gonna teach at the end,
Mhm.
will it even support database automation and like the backend API and database automation part also, or is it just for the UI?
Uh, so when we say it's a framework, it would deal with all the modules within it, right? So we would talk about that architecture, the entire end-to-end architecture, which deals with the
Okay.
UI. Okay. So when we have
Mhm.
uh, what is that, UI automation, so definitely it requires even the um, implementation at a bit of implementation at the database level as well, right? So if you see within the course, so somewhere at the test data driven approach itself, yeah,
Mhm.
we considered this, right? So when implementing this data driven testing with n unit, so you would also deal with the databases.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
it's not just about CSV, Excel. So there are many other. That's where I said it's. I have mentioned here as CSV and Excel. It doesn't mean that I only teach this. So or the databases. So it also involves certain other mechanisms as well, like JSON. So now when somebody says to me, like, which kind of approach you would take when you want to maintain your data, so I don't probably prefer CSV or Excel. Maybe rather I prefer XML or JSON file. Okay. So
Mhm.
now,
Okay.
so we talk about those in depth. That's what I said. So we would deal with each and every concepts that are involved within setting up the framework. So by the end of the modules, by the end of probably module 4, so you would be able to set up a framework locally within your system, right?
Okay.
I Yeah, so once that is done, then we would go for the CI/CD integration. It could be Jenkins or it could be Azure DevOps. Again, we would evaluate what kind of challenges we have when it is with Jenkins, and what kind of advantages and what kind of seamless integration that we would find when it is with Azure DevOps, right? So we would also try to understand those. So it's not just about putting some concept to you people and then explaining it and logging off. So we would try to understand end to end how this testing architecture, end to end agile architecture which we have, so within that, where we fall into, on what kind of uh, test analysis that we need to do just before getting into the automation, right? So selecting a tool, right from selecting a tool to selecting a language, so everything we would discuss, right? Any other questions?
What about API REST Azure?
Uh,
API is
as a part of this one, API testing is also covered.
no, this is specifically for UI automation. So this course is for UI automation. API test automation is a different course altogether.
When you say UA automation, what does it mean?
Sorry, can you come again?
So when you said UA automation, what does it mean? I don't understand.
Yeah, so we would go to that in the introduction. Just the next step is
No,
I would make
I
you people
understand.
understand
Okay.
what is UI automation, what is API automation, and where these fall, right? And what kinds of testing we have. So I would make you people understand that.
Okay.
So are we clear about this course right now?
That's what I was
Yes.
asking you. I was asking you if you can tell me what does it mean by UA automation, so that way I'll
Yes.
be more
Yes.
clear about the
Yeah, I'm
course.
going there. Yeah, I'm going there. Okay. Let me share a whiteboard. Okay. Are you people able to see my whiteboard?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So whenever we talk about automation, right? So everyone call it as test automation. Okay. Now, when we say test automation, it has two branches. So one is UI, the other one they call it as API. Okay. So one is the UI automation, the other one is the API automation. So what is this UI? UI is nothing but user interface. So you would have a definite browser and where your application would be loaded and the test cases that you have, right? So now when I say test cases, the manual test cases, manual functional test cases. Okay. So the manual functional team might have come up with some test cases already. So let's say one of my test case is to search flights on selected date. Okay. So somebody is testing this manually. So what they would do, they would log in into the application. So let's say make my trip is my application. So I need to know what application I test, right? So it is make my trip. So now what happens? So I would open the make my trip website and then in the welcome screen, I would probably select search flights module and then the page would be loaded on the web browser and you would be able to interact with the web elements or the elements that are displayed there, probably the selection for source, selection for the destination, and then the date, and probably option to search, that is the search button to click. So once you click that search button, so the UI would retrieve the details and then display it on the screen, right? So this is something called as UI, purely UI interaction, right? Nowhere you would connect to a database or nowhere the end user would access any of the interfaces or any other third party sites, right? So we would just deal with the UI while testing functionally in a manual way or either by the automated way. So for the test automation, so when I say UI, it is about automating the test cases related to the functional flows at the UI, that is at the user interface. Okay. So now whatever manual way of how I have searched, probably what I would do is I would automate this. So when I say automate, so a manual intervention is not required. Whenever I click to execute my test case, so automatically the script has to interact with the UI and then it by itself it should pull the data of the source and the destination, edit those fields, provide the values of the source and destination, select the date, and then click on the search and evaluate whether the search happened. I mean, the search action happened, and the page is loaded with the search results or not, right? This end to end, whatever scenario just now I have explained, if you are interacting only on the UI and automating that flow, that is the UI automation. Clear on this part? Any questions on this part? UI automation?
No.
Okay. Now let's go to this API. So what is this API? API is the application interface. So it acts as an interface, which actually, when you have filled in your details and clicked on the search button, right? So what happens? Your architecture would be like this. You have a UI, you have a server, and this server connects to a database, and this database can have multiple schemas, and under those multiple tables, right? Now let's say your UI is mostly nowadays UI is developed using Angular JS and React JS components, right? Your UI is built with that particular language, and your server, or let's say you have API, application program interface, right? Now these APIs are the methods that interact with the server, methods that interact with server. So how they interact? So first they would collect the details from the UI. So when you have this search, clicking on the search is an action by the user, right? When this action happens, there would be certain details or the data that you have keyed in, like source, destination, and the date on which I wanted to travel. These details would be carried by the API method, one of the methods within the API, to the server. Your server is something defined in different language, maybe in Java, Python, or C#, or in any other language. Okay, so now what we did, so we have the architecture in this way, wherein your UI interacts with the API, and the API is the integrator which takes the data, collects the data from the UI, and then sends it to the server. Now what server would do, based upon the method, based upon the used method within the API and the data that it sends, so it understands the table into which it might need to place the data, or the table from which it might need to retrieve the data. In the search flights uh, scenario, so it is to retrieve the data, right? It retrieves the data from the database table and again gives it back to the API. So there is UI which is developed in Angular JS or React JS, its language is totally different, and your server and the APIs which are developed in Java, Python, or C#, so they're entirely different, right? But still they would be able to communicate. So they communicate through protocol, HTTP or HTTPS, right? Nowadays this is the protocol which using which they communicate, correct? So that's how this APIs work. APIs would have definite methods, and then the data which that each method might collect from the UI and then send it to the server. Server process it at the DB side and get back with the response, and that response would be again loaded to UI. That's how it works, right? Now what is that API testing? So when we remove this UI from the scope and try to use these methods, right? Test these methods and state or inquire the stability of the application, right? Stability of the application, which application it is? This entire setup from the APIs to database. This is called your backend, right? It is called backend. So when you try to test the APIs, trigger the calls, and then try to understand the stability of the application, the quality of the application, that means it's API testing, wherein there is no UI involved here, right? Clear on this part? There is no UI involved. So once the UI comes into picture, when we integrate our UI to the backend, so that's where this UI comes into picture, and probably manual testers, they come up with some functional test cases, just like the search flights on the selected data, right? So they come up with the scenarios and then start testing it. Now, do we able to automate upfront any kind of functional test cases, or do we able to automate the application upfront just by the time it is deployed? Will you be starting the test automation? Any idea on it? Yes, no? Let this
Can you
No.
session
please,
be interactive.
can you please repeat again? What did you say?
Okay. What my question is, or my query is, so let's say you got your UI deployed, your backend API services and server, everything is established, it is deployed, everything is integrated right now. So do we immediately start your test automation?
Yes, sir.
Specifically, I'm talking about the UI test automation.
Yes, we can do that, sir.
Uh,
If everything is ready, we can start testing, automating, whether it
the
is manual or
recommended
automated.
standard, yeah, the recommended standard is at least for once your application need to be tested manually,
Yes, sir.
right? If it is not manually tested, and
Mhm.
if the application stability is not tested or the quality is not tested at least for once,
Mhm.
so you might face lots of challenges during your during your test scripting and as well as test execution of the scripts, right? So
Yes.
if the application is not stable, even though you have come up with your scripts and if you are executing them, it can lead to false positives and probably some failures, which ideally are not failures as such, right? It can lead to those, right?
So we need to,
That's where,
in that case, we have to perform smoke and sanity test first. Sir.
yeah, definitely we need to. So we will talk about that, but this is something about when you would start your UI test automation. So you need to start only after at least for once the functionally tested test cases are available to you, right? Then you would come to the analysis whether you need to scope it into your test automation, where to scope, into which kind of testing we need to scope it. So that comes in the next phase, later phase. But the primary recommendation is at least for once we need to manually test the test cases. So writing the test case is different. It's all comes under test planning. So people can write test cases manually, but once it need to be executed, right? Manually, those need to be executed on the UI, functionally tested, functionally proven that okay, this particular module is available for us and it is been successfully tested, and then you can go ahead and look into it, like whether to automate it or not, right? Clear on this part?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So this is about the UI testing and the API testing. Now there could be various phases of testing. Okay. So before going to that, I would like to showcase the holistic view on how this end-to-end approach takes place. Right? Let me show you that. Uh, okay. Sharing my screen one more time. Let me know if you are able to see my screen and an image
Yes.
with the end-to-end agile plan or the phases, various phases that we are involved in.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So what is this? This entire eight which we have. So what we call this?
I think it is agile process. Is it?
Right. It is the end-to-end agile process. So this is a continuous process, right? There are various phases within it. The first one is about the planning, right? Planning, which is here. And then it goes to the coding, build, test, right? So within this eight, the first half, whichever you see here, that is all about your development, right? You can see here this circle, this talks all about the development activities where majority of the developers within the team are involved, right? Along with Scrum Master and the product owners. So the entire Scrum team is involved here, correct? And then once the application is tested, what we do, we go for a release, we plan for a release, right? So have you heard about release?
Yes, sir.
Release plan, release
Ye-
management.
Yes.
Yeah. So we plan for a release. And then what we do, once we planned for the release, what happens in the release? So in the release, we come up with the version, the latest and the final full-fledged tested version, which is stable. So we just try to deploy it into the further higher environments, right? Let's say we start this continuous agile end-to-end process from dev environment. So there could be multiple environments for us, like dev, QA, UAT, staging, or and then prod, right? Likewise. Now what happens? Every environment would go through this release, deploy, operations, and monitor, right? Release, deploy, operate, and monitor. The initial plan, code, build, and test. These would happen or fall at these would fall at dev environment and QA environment, right? Developers, when I say developers, it is both, the development team, which has UI development, backend development, and then the testing team as well. Within the testing team, again, functional testers and as well as the automation testers. Entirely, this constitutes as the dev team. Now, what happens? We would do the planning, code, build it, and test it probably on dev and QA. And from there onwards, we would plan for our release. So once we have tested it and said like our code base, the latest code base, whichever we want to release into the further environment, is stable, then we would take that particular release candidate and then start deploying it into further environments. So dev is with this circle, and within the 8, release, deploy, operates, and monitor, these are all something related to the operations. So that's where the DevOps team come into picture, right? Have you heard about it? DevOps.
Yes, sir.
So the CI/CD, the continuous monitoring, continuous integration, we talk about them a lot of time, right? So this
Yes.
is where it comes. So you can see here in the release, it is a continuous integration, right? Release comes into continuous integration where you can use Jenkins, Bamboo, Hudson, Azure DevOps, or AWS as well, right? So these all come into continuous integration. And now, what are the tools that we use during our testing phase in the QA environment are for continuous testing? It could be Zephyr for coming up with the functional test cases, I mean the manual test cases, or it could be Test Complete, SOAP UI, Postman, Selenium, TestNG, JUnit, and NUnit frameworks, right? Or it also constitute of Playwright, Cypress. So these all help for the continuous testing, right? Within the dev, so the test phase would have those many tools. Azure DevOps, so even you can maintain in Azure DevOps your test plan, right? You can come up with the manual test cases in Azure DevOps. You can use HPALM, right? ALM QC. So that's also one of the end-to-end project management tool, wherein test plan and the test suits we can form or frame within the HPLM, right? So these are all the tools that are part of our testing. So in the day-to-day activities, probably you can use these tools at your local itself. On the local machine, you would be able to access them. You would be able to set up. You would be able to come up with the test scripts. You would be able to execute the automated scripts or the manual functional functional test cases. So you would be able to execute them locally. But why we have come up with this kind of approach, where you need a continuous integration and some other cloud diagnostic tools, and then the continuous development which happens at the coding side. So both at test automation level and as well as the development level. So the coding is where we would use our Bitbucket, Git, right? GitHub. So there are various other continuous development tools where you would have a centralized repository into which you push your code changes, right? You maintain them in a central repository with versioning. Why? Because it's not just you who works on the project. So there can be lots of requirements and lots of development happening. So nobody might know which is the latest version that they need to pick. So that's where the Bitbucket or the GitHub, they come into picture, which help us in versioning the code, and as well as we also would come up with the code code review and pushing of the code. What we say, uh, merging techniques, right? We would do the code review as well. So your peers would be reviewing your PRs, or you would be reviewing the other developers PRs, right? That's something which helps us to review each other's code, find out any loopholes that are there, and then fix them instantly, such that our code changes doesn't impact the existing code base of the application, right? We would discuss in detail about this. No need to worry about it. It's just high level. I'm just giving the information for you people. But when we talk about this continuous development and the Git, so at that time we would definitely work on those and then try to understand all the concepts within it, right? And also the keywords that we use. And then the continuous deployment, wherein again the pipelines that we set up, right? It could be using Puppet, Chef, Ansible. Now we use Azure DevOps with YAML files, right? So we create the pipelines within Azure DevOps itself, or we can use Jenkins as well to push the code changes or the deployment, right? And then the monitoring service, continuous monitoring. Why we require this continuous monitoring, and what kind of advantages we have with continuous monitoring, we would see that as well. So end to end, this is how your agile works, and we fall here at testing. Does it mean that we only involve at this phase? Testers only involve at the testing phase? Does it mean that? Anyone?
Yes, sir. I think tester can involve in the pipeline phase as well. Tell the pipeline, so they
Okay,
can run their tests in the pipeline as well.
correct. So we fall a bit into operations as well, right? And any
Yes.
other phases within this you feel that we should be involved in?
It starts from the plan, code, and build test as well.
Right, right. So
It's kind
right
of
now, sorry, come again. Anyone? Any questions? Okay, let me go ahead. So,
staging part as well as staging.
right, staging is, that is what, deployment, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, right. So we also do involve right from the planning. So what we do, we also join the grooming sessions, right? We also try to understand the functionality, because for testers, it is majorly required to understand the functionality, right? Until unless we understand the functionality and the functional requirements, we may not be able to come up with the test cases, I mean the functional test cases, by the functional testers or the manual testers. And then for the SDETs as well, if we do not understand the functional flow, we may not understand where to start with our automation and primarily where to focus on, right? If you want to scope, maybe the functional tester might have written hundreds of test cases, right? And now within those hundreds of test cases, if you want to know the scope of your work, I mean the automation, the bread and butter for the automation is probably your regression test cases. Okay, we'll see what is this regression in next class. We'll discuss about various types of testing as well. But let's say like your regression phase has some thousand test cases. It doesn't necessarily mean all these thousand test cases can be automated. We should have that automation mindset, right? We should create that mindset. We should cultivate that mindset first. So it is necessary need not to be like all these thousand need to be automated, right? So there could be certain tests which may not be automatable. It is possible. If it is all the thousand are automatable, well and good. That would provide us 100% coverage, and as well as 100% saving the efforts as well, right? So we save certain efforts, right? Manually testing 1000 might take more time. When you have 100% coverage in automation, it's well and good. Your application supports it and you are here to automate, so you would be able to automate them, correct? So we in your automation mindset, you doesn't necessarily need to feel that all the 100 test cases or the 1000 test cases that are there in your suite need to be automated. Okay, so that's where we would come up with some analysis, right? Automation analysis as well. Clear on this part? Clear?
Yes, sir.
Right. So this is how it is. This continuous integration is something which would help us to seamlessly integrate, test, and then decide on the release. So if there are lots of failures in your test report, so maybe the release management team might uh, you know even reject that particular release. They are authorized to. So what your testing ideally has is your test planning, test execution, test reporting, right? Where somebody asked about extent reports. I said Allure reports are also there. Azure integrated internal Azure reports are there. Dashboards are there, right? So all these help the team to realize or to realize the stability of the application and the quality of the application, right? And whether to go ahead with the release or not. So this is the phase which is very much important, right? And this is the phase which is kind of a single time setup. Okay, when we come up with a pipeline, that pipeline is there. So it's all about the maintenance. This part, operations, is where most of maintenance would happen, and the automation scripts. So this testing phase where you would also have development, right? Test script development. So you plan for it, you develop them, and then you execute them, and then you integrate it to the pipelines such that your reports are centralized, right? And then every stakeholder would be able to access the reports, test reports, and accordingly they can take a call on whether to go ahead with the release or not. If we are going ahead with the release, then it would be like your deployment to the higher environments, be it UAT stage or into the prod, and then the operations and the continuous monitoring. This is all about the maintenance, right? This is how this end-to-end agile works, and this is where we fall. So we fall under planning, we fall under testing, we also fall a bit into the deployment activities as well, right? So when I say deployment activities, QA should own the deployments onto the QA environment. What is my statement? QA team should own the deployments onto the QA environment, right? We will see and discuss in detail why it is, and then in one of the sessions, uh, so we would discuss on that as well. Okay, just remember this statement, like QA is the gatekeeper for the QA environment. Okay, clear on this part? When
Yes,
we
sir.
try our CI/CD, either from Jenkins or from the Azure DevOps, then I will again come to this part. I will explain why, right? So at that time, you would clearly understand why we need to be the gatekeepers for the QA environment. Clear on this part?
Yes. So,
Okay.
is checking the code into QA environment is it similar to the deployment of QA?
Yes, yes. Deployment to the
Okay,
QA environment. Yes,
okay,
it is. Yeah. So I would stop the session here. We will take up regarding the Selenium and its architecture tomorrow. Okay.
okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
sir. Thank
Thank you very much.